being able to really understand my history, my genealogy, just understanding just how my ancestors grew up and just learning more about them. I felt like that has been the part when we started having more older family passing, realizing our history was passing. And so we made a collective effort in our family to make sure that we were really digging into our history, finding out where everyone was, where everyone is, where people buried at, just really trying to dig into that. And so that just made that sense of pride. So it's not anything I'm going to learn in the history book about our particular family, but just understanding my Blackness and where that comes from, and just understanding how important in all the many things and stories and all the people I've met that are all family, all sprinkled all around here. When thinking about intersectionality, thinking about myself and my different identities, I want to make sure that I'm not just one-sided. I'm only seeing one perspective, because I want to be multifaceted. I'm all different things, but I want to be able to understand the fight of others that may not necessarily identify like me, because I also want to be an ally just as much as I want allies to be for us. I also want to be that, so I don't want to expect for people to be pouring into me, but I don't do anything in return. So, because that's the only way we can get this thing right? So I find myself wanting to make sure that I'm connecting to those that I don't identify with, and then, of course, those who I do identify, just to ensure that, I'm building up where we are, and then I'm also learning more that I might have to take over here or could take over there, just to be able to bring us together and realize we're trying to get this thing right.
The thing with being South Asian American, Indian American, right, is that it's split within really two cohorts. So you have a bucket of, obviously by class, people upper middle class, upper class, right? And then you really have working class, which aggregates the majority of Indian Americans in the United States, the people that run gas stations, that mop your floors, that work in restaurants, that work in auto mechanic shops, truck drivers, you name it. And then you have the doctors and engineers and entrepreneurs and lawyers and academic types, right? And so for me, I saw from a very early age bifurcation in that community between the classes of people. And I would wonder at Temple, right, there were kids I would hang out with, but I would never see them at the same social events and parties that my family would attend growing up, right? And I realized later on, especially in my teenage years, when someone brought that up, the professionals hang out with each other, I didn't understand what that meant, right? Now looking back, I realized, higher educated Indian Americans and Indian Americans with a higher socioeconomic status, they don't candidly socialize outside of religious activities where they have to with lower socioeconomic status Indian Americans in Sikhs, particularly in my Sikh community. And there was a lot of guilt, right? But also a lot of oh wow, this is just how people were conditioned for years. And then spending time in India with my family, where it's even more segmented, right? Where it's not only the academics don't make enough to, and the doctors don't even make enough to run in the circles that the lawyers and business type people do, right? And just realizing that there's so much more progress, that even if you accept your community, right, and you say you accept your community, do you accept your community in every aspect of your life? Do you accept them in marrying your children? Do you accept them in coming over to your home? Do you accept them in supporting their business endeavors? When you get a nice, fancy, shiny, multi-million-dollar building and they're opening up, a single unit on the southwest side, right? Are you supporting their endeavors in the same way? And I think that was incredibly formative. And don't get me wrong, I think my community shines in supporting when times are tough, but when times are okay or good, right? Do we just lean back on non-emergency instincts of we should be separate with one another? And is that reminiscent of a caste system that America has but doesn't outline in the same gruesome way the Indian society might?
One of the most defining moments that I really that is poignant in my career regarding intersectionality is a conversation I had with a mentor of mine, Dr. Eugene Schatz. He was someone I trained with and had the fortunate ability to came back and work together. He's a great mentor, and he was one of those people who embodied what allyship, sponsorship, and all that was before we were identified Jewish man. And I just say that because I put it in perspective for people as you listen to the story. So about 10 years ago, I was called by my organization to step up into a leadership role. And what was most unfortunate about that time is for about almost a year, I really struggled because people who I had trained with and even trained me and I worked with for years, they weren't supportive of the organization's decision. And so I never forget, I was talking to Dr. Shax, and we were having this conversation, and he was asking how I was going out, and he looks at me and he says, well, Lisa, do you think it's because you're younger than me, because you're black, or because you're young? And my mouth dropped at that time. I was like, what? You know, and I said, and I really, I'll be honest, in that moment, I didn't want to admit because I was black. And he looks at me and he says, well, it's all three. And that was a defining moment for me. And I rest in that space and I tell that story to my colleagues because a lot of times we don't want to admit that the struggles that we're going through are because we're young, we're black, and we're female. And that's because we don't want to identify with our intersectionality. But some of that is because there's still those times where we feel and we know we're not welcomed in the room, but then there's those little inklings because we say, well, am I supposed to be in the room? But he reminded me that the people who saw in me that leadership, the things that he had provided to me as far as recommendations for leadership training, they see in me. And he was like, just step into that space. And so that is, and to remains to this day, a poignant time in my career.
Probably the biggest part of my identity is my motherhood, and always has been my motherhood. I was a young mother. I was just out of high school when I became pregnant with my oldest son, who was born with special needs and disabilities. So I was thrown into the disability community full force at a very young age, and that really shaped who I became as a person. First, initially, with my motherhood, I really felt like I was only a mother and could only be a mother, and there was nothing else for me, especially when my son was first born with all these complications. But then as he grew older and as I realized that I wanted to dive more into the community, I started including him in those spaces with my other children. And I realized that, it was so important for him to be visible and for me to, as hard as it was sometimes and as difficult as it was and how many challenges we faced and how many hospital visits were in between all of the community things, I was still able to show a world that other people might not know or understand. And so my son brought out so much understanding from people. And when we walked into different spaces, people didn't understand. They asked a lot of questions, and people were able to see, oh, you can have a disability and be in this space and be at a protest right in the front, marching and hold signs with your family. And, you can show up at a social event and where the mayor is and be seen. And I think that he brought so much joy to everybody who would see him in those spaces too. So definitely so many different worlds had to be interweaved. Otherwise, I would not be who I am today. And I had to make that choice intentionally to say, you know what, I'm so much more than just mom. I am an educator, I am a leader, I am all of these, I have all of these skills, and I want to serve in more than just my household. So when I started to open my world up to that, the community embraced my family completely, and that's something that truly changed my life and is still a part of my life today.
I think West Michigan is a very interesting place when it comes to like identity and creating a space for yourself, explaining who you are. I think oftentimes when I start introducing myself as a former refugee, it's oftentimes patronized. I'm oftentimes patronized, like saying that, oh my gosh, the hard life that you have lived. without asking questions or like asking what I need, because the knowledge that they have of refugees is through the media, and oftentimes media doesn't portray that, right? I would love to see West Michigan being a little open, and even like little open just to ask the right questions, or to ask questions that would not not only answer their questions but give them a whole picture. So yeah, West Michigan interesting place in terms of like for individual who just immigrate in here and trying to create their own identity.